The Missing Train from Dover, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. The Empty Timetable. In the autumn of 1889, London settled beneath one of those low, restless fogs that seem to rise from the Thames itself and creep along every street until even the gas lamps burned dim and orange, like coals seen through smoke. It was on such an evening that I returned to our rooms at Baker Street, having spent the day attending to a difficult case of pleurisy in Kensington, and found my friend Sherlock Holmes in a mood I had rarely observed in him before. Not idle, not occupied, but waiting. 1. He sat by the window with an unlit pipe between his teeth, a folded telegram resting on his knee, and an expression that suggested his mind had already run 3 steps ahead of whatever news that telegram contained. "You look like a man expecting a visitor, Holmes," I said, removing my coat. "I look like a man expecting a mystery, Watson, which is considerably more interesting." He did not turn from the window. "A telegram arrived an hour ago from the South Eastern Railway. It was brief. It was also, I think, the beginning of something remarkable." "What does it say?" He handed it to me without a word. I read it twice before I trusted my own eyes. Continental Express, departed Dover Priory, 9:47 p.m. Never arrived Charing Cross. Line searched. No wreckage found. Please come at once. I lowered the paper. An entire train, Holmes? Not merely its passengers, as one reads of sometimes in the penny dreadfuls, but the train itself. So it would appear. He finally turned to face me, and I saw that familiar light kindling behind his grey eyes. The one that told me a problem had already begun to interest him more than he cared to admit. An engine, a tender, 6 carriages, a guard's van, and by the passenger count, some 71 souls. All of it swallowed by 26 miles of ordinary English countryside between Ashford and London. Surely, there has been some error in the reporting. A derailment in fog, a signal failure. A derailment leaves wreckage, Watson. A signal failure leaves a train sitting foolishly on the wrong section of track, inconveniencing everyone and injuring no one's dignity but the signalman's. Neither leaves an absence. He rose and began, as was his habit, to pace the length of the room. This telegram describes neither an accident nor a delay. It describes a vanishing. Before I could press him further, we heard the bell below, followed by hurried footsteps upon the stair. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, slightly breathless. "A Mr. Edmund Thorne to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says the matter cannot wait. Show him up at once." The gentleman who entered was perhaps 50 years of age, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered, slightly anxious look of a man who spent his life among timetables and had just discovered that time itself had betrayed him. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and his hand shook faintly as he extended it toward Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the hour. I am Edmund Thorne, Director of Operations for the South Eastern Railway. I believe you received our telegram." "I did." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne, and tell us everything, in order, and with no detail omitted, however small it may seem to you." Thorne lowered himself into the chair Holmes indicated, set his portfolio upon his knees, and drew a long breath before he began. "The Continental Express is our finest service, Mr. Holmes. It connects with the cross-channel steamers at Dover and carries passengers directly through to Charing Cross, without another stop. Diplomats use it. Businessmen use it. Last night it carried 71 passengers who had come off the evening boat from Calais." "At what hour did it depart Dover?" "At 9:47. Precisely on schedule. The station master at Dover confirms this without hesitation. He watched it leave the platform himself. And its expected arrival, 11:50 at Charing Cross. It never came." Thorne's hands tightened upon the portfolio. "By midnight, we had wired every signal box along the route. Everyone confirmed the train had passed their section on schedule until it reached the box at Paddock Wood, some 11 miles beyond Ashford." Holmes leaned forward. "And beyond Paddock Wood?" "Nothing, Mr. Holmes. The signalman at the next box, at Tonbridge, logged no train passing at all that night upon that line. Not ours, not any other. A silence fell over the room. I confess my first instinct was disbelief, the same instinct that had greeted the telegram, but Holmes's expression had grown entirely still, the stillness that I had long ago learned to recognize as the deepest form of his attention. You searched the line between these 2 points? Thoroughly. Every yard of track, every cutting, every embankment. There is no wreckage, no debris, not so much as a broken pane of glass. And the passengers' families? Thorne's face darkened further. Telegrams have arrived all morning. Husbands who did not come home. A member of Parliament expected at a dinner. A French gentleman said to be carrying documents of some diplomatic sensitivity, though of that I know little. It was arranged through the Foreign Office, rather than through us directly. Holmes rose sharply at this, crossed to the mantelpiece, and stood a moment with his back to us, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. A diplomatic passenger, he murmured, carried upon a train that has ceased to exist between 2 ordinary Kentish stations. Mr. Thorne, I will take your case, but I warn you, I suspect we shall find that the mystery here is not how 71 people and an entire train could vanish. I suspect we shall find that someone wished us to believe precisely that, and worked very hard indeed to arrange it. Thorne stared at him. You believe it a deception, Mr. Holmes. I believe, Mr. Thorne, that trains do not vanish. Only explanations do, when we have not yet earned them. He reached for his coat. Come, Watson, there is a milk train to Ashford within the hour, and I intend to be upon it. Chapter 2. The Signal Box at Paddock Wood. The journey down through Kent was a slow and uncomfortable one, for the milk train stopped at every wayside halt, and dawn had barely broken by the time we reached Ashford. Holmes had scarcely spoken during the journey, save to consult a folded ordnance map upon his knee, tracing the line of the railway with one long finger, as though he might discover, through study alone, the precise point at which reality had failed. At Ashford, we were met by Inspector Lestrade, summoned by the Yard, once the Foreign Office had taken an interest in the affair. He looked, as ever, faintly displeased to require Holmes's assistance, and faintly relieved to have it. Mr. Holmes, I confess, I do not know what to make of this one. Then we are, for once, in perfect agreement, Lestrade. What have you learned? Very little that makes sense. The train passed Ashford Station at 10:14, confirmed by 2 porters and the station master. It was seen by a signalman at a box called Smeeth some 4 miles further on, at approximately 10:20. After that, Lestrade spread his hands. Nothing. The next signal box. Paddock Wood, manned by a fellow named Josiah Pratt. He swears no train passed his box that night upon the down line at all. Then let us speak to Mr. Pratt. We proceeded by hired trap along a narrow lane that ran parallel to the railway embankment, the morning mist still clinging to the hedgerows on either side. The signal box at Paddock Wood stood upon a slight rise, a modest wooden structure with tall windows overlooking the double line of track. Pratt himself, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers, met us at the foot of the stairs. "I've told the inspector everything already," he said, before Holmes had spoken a word. "No doubt," Holmes replied pleasantly, "but you have not yet told me." "Humour, an old man's curiosity, Mr. Pratt. At what hour did you come on duty?" 9 o'clock. Relieved, Tom Ainsley. "And your log for the Continental Express?" Pratt produced a heavy ledger and opened it with trembling hands to the relevant page. Holmes studied it in silence for a long moment. "You logged the Smeeth box signal at 10:22, he said at last. "You logged nothing thereafter upon the down line until a goods train at 11:55. There is a gap of 93 minutes in which, by every account we possess, the Continental Express should have passed your box and did not. I know it, sir. I've turned it over in my mind 100 times. I did not fall asleep. I did not leave my post. I watched that line the whole while, for I remember thinking how thick the mist had grown. Tom's a 9. Holmes's eyes narrowed very slightly. The mist was thick, thick as I've ever seen it along this stretch. It comes up off the low ground beyond the cutting, sir, of an autumn night. I could barely see the down signal from my window, though it stands not 80 yards off. And yet you are certain no train passed. I heard nothing, sir. No whistle, no wheels upon the rail. I'd have felt it, if nothing else. This box shakes something dreadful when the express goes by. Holmes turned to the window and studied the line below for some time without speaking. I watched him note the cutting some distance ahead, where the track curved gently out of sight behind a stand of elms, and the low embankment beyond it, where the mist, even now in daylight, seemed to linger longer than elsewhere. "Mr. Pratt," he said at last, "is there any point between Smeeth and your own box at which the line passes out of a signalman's sight for any appreciable distance?" "The cutting yonder, sir, by Barham Wood. The line runs through it for the better part of half a mile, and neither box can see into it directly." "And has it always run through it? There has been no alteration to the route in your memory?" Pratt hesitated, and something in that hesitation caught my attention as surely as it caught Holmes's. "There was talk once, sir, years back, before my time here, of an old spur that used to run off through the wood. Chalk workings, I believe, or some such. It was closed up long since. I've never seen it myself, only heard the older men speak of it." Holmes turned to him with sudden sharpness. "Who spoke of it?" "Old Ainsley's father, sir, who held this box before him. He used to say the wood was full of forgotten track, laid down in his grandfather's day and never properly torn up." For a long moment, Holmes said nothing at all. Then he smiled, and it was not, I confess, an entirely comfortable smile to witness. "Lestrade," he said quietly, "I believe we shall want to walk through Barham Wood before the day is out." Chapter 3. Barham Wood. The wood itself, when we reached it an hour later, proved larger and darker than I had expected. A tangle of oak and hazel grown up thick along the flank of the cutting, with the railway running below like a scar through its centre. Holmes moved through the undergrowth with the quick, purposeful stride of a hound that has caught the first thread of a scent, pausing now and again to examine the ground, the trees, the very texture of the soil beneath our feet. "Observe the undergrowth here, Watson," he said, crouching beside a tangle of bramble that had been, I now saw, quite deliberately disturbed, and then arranged to appear undisturbed again. "Someone has passed this way, and passed this way often, and has taken some pains that the fact should not be noticed by a careless eye. You believe there is truth in the signalman's story, then? An old spur line? I believe there is truth in most old stories, Watson, though rarely the truth their tellers imagine." He rose and pressed onward, and within a few minutes more we came upon it, a shallow depression running through the trees, overgrown with grass and scrub, but unmistakably, once one's eye had been trained to see it, the bed of a vanished railway line. Lestrade stared at it with open astonishment. "Good heavens! It runs directly toward the main line." "It runs directly from the main line, Lestrade, which is a rather more important distinction, as we shall soon discover." Holmes knelt beside the old bed and brushed away a season's leaves with his hand. Beneath them, half sunk into the earth, lay the corroded remnant of an iron rail. "This has lain here undisturbed for years, by its condition. Decades, perhaps." "Then it can have nothing to do with last night," I said. "On the contrary, Watson, it may have everything to do with last night, precisely because everyone would reason as you have just reasoned." He continued along the old bed, and we followed him deeper into the wood, until, quite suddenly, he stopped before a low mound of ivy and fallen branches that concealed, I now saw, as he tore several handfuls away, an ancient iron switch, rusted almost solid, half buried where the old spur had once joined the main line. He studied it for a long while in silence. Then his expression changed. "Lestrade, send a man back to fetch tools, a crowbar, and oil, if any can be found in the village." "You cannot mean this old thing has been used." "I mean precisely that. Observe the surface of the lever here. where the rust has been worn away quite recently, and freshly, by the friction of a human hand. Holmes held up his own palm, faintly darkened with rust. This switch has been thrown, and thrown more than once, within recent months, perhaps within recent days. A cold unease settled over me as the implication became clear. You believe the Continental Express was diverted from the main line onto this old spur? I believe it is the only explanation consistent with every fact we have gathered. A train traveling at speed through thick mist upon a section of line invisible to either neighboring signal box, its engine driver watching the signals ahead rather than the ground beneath his wheels. If a switch were thrown at precisely the correct moment and thrown back again immediately after, the train would leave the main line entirely, and no one along its intended route would ever know it had gone. Lestrade's face had gone quite pale. But to where, Mr. Holmes? A single mile of overgrown track leading into a wood can scarcely swallow an entire express train and hold it hidden. No, Holmes agreed slowly, his eyes following the old bed as it curved away into deeper shadow beneath the trees. It cannot. Which tells us, Inspector, that this old spur is very much longer than a single mile, and that it leads somewhere its builders were most anxious no one should ever find. Chapter 4. The Chalk Beneath Kent. It took the better part of that afternoon to clear enough of the ancient switch mechanism to satisfy Holmes that his theory held, and by the time we had done so, evening was again drawing on, and a fine, persistent rain had begun to fall through the leafless branches above us. Lestrade had dispatched constables to guard the site, and we returned to the village inn at Smeeth to take stock of what we had learned. The line must lead somewhere, Holmes, I said, as we sat before a modest fire with our supper before us. A railway spur, however old, does not simply end in the middle of a wood. No, it does not. Holmes had scarcely touched his food. Instead, he had spread his ordnance map across the table and was tracing, with a pencil, the direction in which the old bed had run before it vanished beneath the deeper undergrowth. And I noticed something curious in its bearing, Watson. It runs not toward any town or works that I can discover marked upon this map, but toward the chalk downs south of here, where the ground rises and, if I am not mistaken, where a man might dig very deeply indeed without troubling the surface above. Lestrade frowned over the map. Chalk workings? There were such things in this county once, I believe, though most were abandoned before living memory. Before living memory, perhaps, but not necessarily before written memory. Holmes folded the map thoughtfully. I believe, gentlemen, that our answer lies not in these fields, but in whatever records the government keeps of engineering works undertaken in this district during the early part of the century. And there is only one man in England whose knowledge of such buried and inconvenient facts I would trust absolutely. Your brother, I said. My brother. Holmes rose from the table with sudden decision. We return to London tonight, Watson, and tomorrow we visit Mycroft. The Diogenes Club received us, as it always did, with the hushed and faintly disapproving silence of an institution built expressly for men who wished never to be disturbed. Mycroft Holmes awaited us in the small stranger's room reserved for such rare occasions. His large frame settled comfortably into a chair, a folder of papers already prepared upon the table before him. Sherlock. He inclined his head. Dr. Watson, I confess I expected you within the day, once word of the Dover train reached the appropriate desks. You have already made inquiries. I have already made inquiries, and I have found something which I suspect will interest you considerably. Mycroft opened the folder and withdrew a set of yellowed engineering drawings, their edges soft with age. In the year 1804, at the height of our fears of a French invasion, a private company was granted permission to construct a series of tunnels and galleries beneath the chalk of this stretch of coast, intended, officially, to store munitions and provisions against the possibility of a landing at Dover. Officially, Sherlock repeated, with faint emphasis. Officially, The works were never completed as originally planned. Bonaparte's ambitions turned elsewhere, funds ran short, and the company that had undertaken the digging was quietly dissolved some years later. The tunnels, so far as any government record shows, were sealed and abandoned in 1822. And the spur line that once served them? Mycroft's heavy eyebrows rose very slightly, the closest expression he permitted himself to genuine surprise. You have found it already, I see. We have found its remains in a wood south of Ashford, and evidence that a switch connecting it to the main line has been used, and recently. For a long moment Mycroft said nothing at all, his fingers resting upon the old drawings as though weighing some private calculation. There is a detail in these records, Sherlock, which the department that filed them evidently thought unimportant, and which I think you will find rather less so. The company that built these tunnels was never formally wound up. It changed hands twice, quietly, through the sale of certain leases and freeholds, and it exists, on paper at least, to this day. It is called, somewhat grandly, the Cinque Ports Subterranean Company. And who, Holmes asked quietly, presently controls it? Mycroft turned over a final page. That, my dear brother, is precisely the question the Foreign Office would very much like answered, given that the gentleman aboard your vanished train was carrying a memorandum touching upon the disposition of certain naval works at Chatham, and given that France, at this present delicate moment in our relations, would pay handsomely to know their contents. Chapter 4, Second Part, The Waiting Rooms of Charing Cross. Before Holmes turned his full attention to the manifest, there was a duty neither of us could in conscience avoid, and it was Holmes himself, somewhat to my surprise, who insisted upon it. A visit to the families of the missing, gathered by that second morning in a waiting room at Charing Cross, set aside for them by a railway company that scarcely knew what else to offer. It was a difficult scene to witness. Some 40 men and women sat or stood about the room in attitudes of exhausted grief, clutching cups of tea gone cold, starting at every footstep in the corridor beyond. A clergyman moved quietly among them, offering what comfort words could provide. Holmes removed his hat as we entered, and I saw upon his face an expression I associated less with the detective than with the man beneath the detective, a rare and private gentleness he seldom permitted strangers to observe. "I will not trouble you long," he said, addressing the room generally, "and I bring you no certainty, for I have none to give. But I promise you this, your husbands, your wives, your sons and daughters did not perish through any failure of an engine or a signal. Something was done, deliberately, by human hands, and human hands can be found and answered for. I ask only that any of you who received any communication in recent weeks, however trivial it seemed at the time, come forward now." A silence followed, and then a thin, anxious woman rose from her chair near the window. "My husband received a letter, sir, some 10 days past, inviting him to travel by the later boat than he had originally planned, so that he might make the acquaintance of a business associate crossing on the same crossing. He thought it a pleasant courtesy at the time." Holmes was beside her in an instant. "Do you have the letter?" "I do, sir. I could not think why I kept it, only that something about it troubled me, though I could not have said what." The letter, when Holmes examined it a few minutes later in a quieter corner of the room, proved brief and unremarkable in its phrasing, save for one detail that caught his eye at once. The notepaper bore, very faintly, the same watermark he had already begun to associate, though he did not yet say so aloud, with the papers found in Professor Voss's affair some years before, a mark he had never expected to encounter again. "Watson," he murmured, holding the page to the light. "Someone has been remarkably thorough. This is not merely a train stopped by chance upon an inconvenient night. Passengers were persuaded, gently and by unremarkable means, to travel upon this particular service rather than another, so that a particular arrangement of persons might be achieved aboard it. We spoke that morning with a dozen more families, and in 3 further instances found some small trace of similar persuasion, a delayed departure suggested by an obliging clerk, a change of carriage recommended by a porter who could not afterward be found or identified, a letter of introduction that led one family's son to book a passage he had not originally intended to take at all. None of it, taken singly, would have troubled the most careful investigator. Taken together, it formed a pattern that chilled me considerably more than any single dramatic clue could have done. "Someone has been arranging this train's passenger list for weeks, Watson," Holmes said grimly, as we left Charing Cross that afternoon, with the patience of a chess player, setting pieces upon a board long before the game itself is ever seen to begin. Whatever purpose required these particular 70 people in this particular arrangement aboard this particular train was planned with a care that troubles me a great deal more than any wreckage or violence could have done. You believe the passengers themselves were chosen for some purpose, then, and not merely swept up as a convenient number to obscure some other business? I believe, Watson, that we shall not know the answer to that question until we have found the false Mr. Ferris and asked him ourselves. But I confess, I no longer believe this affair to be so simple as a single stolen document and an opportunistic crime. Someone has spent a very great deal of thought, and very possibly a very great deal of money, ensuring that this train, upon this night, carried exactly what its architect required it to carry. Chapter 5. The False Passenger. We returned to Baker Street that evening in a mood of grave and mounting concentration, for the affair had shifted, in the space of a single conversation, from a railway curiosity into a matter touching the security of the realm. Holmes spent the following morning at Scotland Yard, examining, at Lestrade's grudging invitation, the full passenger manifest of the Continental Express, and it was shortly after noon that he returned to our rooms bearing a single sheet of paper and an expression of the keenest interest. "Watson, I want you to look at this list and tell me what strikes you as curious." I studied the manifest, a long column of names, occupations, and points of embarkation. I confess, nothing strikes me at all. It appears an ordinary list of respectable travellers. Precisely, and that is itself curious, for I have had Lestrade's men verify every name upon it against the steamer's own passenger register from Calais, and one name defeats them entirely. He tapped a line near the bottom of the page. A Mr. Aldous Ferris, ticketed through from Calais, seat assigned in the fourth carriage. No such passenger boarded the steamer. No such passenger exists upon any register at Calais, nor, so far as inquiries in London can discover, anywhere in England. A false name, then. A false name, purchased in person, in cash, 3 days before the crossing, at the Dover booking office, by a gentleman the clerk recalls only vaguely as tall and well-dressed. Holmes set the paper down and began, once more, his familiar, restless pacing. "Now consider, Watson, why a man who never intended to travel at all should trouble himself to purchase a ticket." I turned the question over for a moment before the answer, dimly, presented itself, to be counted among the passengers without ever being present to be missed. Exactly so. If the true number of travellers aboard that train had been 70, and someone wished it to appear as 71, the simplest device in the world is to invent a 71st who is never actually there. It costs the deceiver nothing but the price of a single ticket, and it ensures that whatever true purpose required an altered count should pass entirely unnoticed. But why alter the count at all? Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular light I had come to associate with the moment a case first began, truly, to yield. That, my dear Watson, is the very question I intend to put to Mr. Edmund Thorne this afternoon, together with one further question that I suspect he alone, among all we have spoken with, is capable of answering. We found Thorne at his office near Charing Cross, a room lined with timetables and ledgers, the director himself looking as though he had slept little since the affair began. Holmes wasted no time upon preliminaries. "Mr. Thorne, I require the seating arrangement of every passenger aboard the Continental Express, by carriage and by compartment, cross-referenced against the true manifest rather than the falsified one." Thorne, plainly startled by the word falsified, nonetheless produced the necessary papers within the half hour, and Holmes spread them across the desk, studying them with a concentration so total that neither Thorne nor I dared interrupt him for the better part of 20 minutes. At length, he sat back, and I saw upon his face an expression I had rarely seen there before. Not merely satisfaction at a puzzle solved, but something closer to genuine unease. "Mr. Thorne," he said quietly, "which compartment in the fourth carriage was assigned to the passenger travelling under the name Ferris?" Thorne checked the plan. "Compartment 3, sir." "And which passenger occupied the compartment immediately adjoining it?" "That would be a Monsieur Girard, the French gentleman I mentioned, sir, said to be carrying papers of diplomatic weight." Holmes rose slowly from his chair and crossed to the window, where he stood a long while in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out upon the ordinary bustle of the London afternoon. "Watson," he said at last, without turning, "I begin to suspect that the false Mr. Ferris was never intended merely to alter account. I suspect he was intended to occupy a particular seat at a particular hour for a particular purpose, and that the purpose in question concerned not the train as a whole, but one man aboard it in particular." Chapter 6. The Man in Compartment 3. That evening brought an unexpected caller to our rooms. A caller who arrived, as Thorne himself confided to us later, entirely at his own suggestion rather than by any invitation of ours. A tall, narrow-faced gentleman of perhaps 40, dressed with a precision that suggested either great wealth or great care, presented himself at our door shortly after 9 and gave his name, in careful, accented English, as Etienne Fournier. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, once seated. "I am told you are investigating the disappearance of the Dover train." "I am. And you, sir, are connected to the affair. How, precisely?" "Monsieur Girard, who travelled upon that train, was my colleague at the French embassy. We were, in a sense, engaged upon the same delicate errand, though by different routes, so that should misfortune befall one courier, the other might yet succeed." Fournier's composure, though carefully maintained, could not entirely conceal a deep and evident anxiety. I confess, I did not expect misfortune to take quite so extraordinary a form. Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "You knew Girard well. Well enough to know that he was not a careless man, Mr. Holmes, nor an easily frightened one. And well enough to have received, 3 days before his journey, a letter which he showed me in some perplexity, and which I have not been able to forget since." "What manner of letter?" Fournier reached into his coat and produced a folded page, somewhat creased from handling. It was unsigned. It contained only a single sentence, and Girard laughed at it when first he read it to me, though I confess I did not entirely share his amusement. Holmes took the page and read the sentence aloud, slowly, as though weighing each word. "The gentleman in the next compartment will not trouble you until Barham Wood." A silence fell over the room. I felt, not for the first time in this affair, a distinct chill pass along my spine. "He received this before he had ever seen the seating arrangement," Holmes said quietly, "which means whoever sent it had already determined, in advance, precisely where Girard would sit, and precisely where the vanishing would occur. This was not an accident that befell a train, Fournier. This was an operation planned with extraordinary care against one specific man." Fournier's face had grown pale. "Then you believe Girard was the true target? Not the train, not the other passengers?" "I believe," Holmes said, rising to pace once more, "that 70 true passengers, together with one invented one, served a single purpose: to disguise the fact that this entire elaborate machinery existed for the sake of a single man and whatever he carried upon his person. Tell me, Fournier, and I ask this with the gravest seriousness, what, precisely, did Girard's papers concern?" Fournier hesitated a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "A survey, Mr. Holmes." A confidential survey of the coastal defences and submarine works recently completed near Chatham prepared for an exchange of technical information between our two governments under the terms of a private understanding. In the wrong hands, such a document would be of very great value indeed to certain interests hostile to both our nations. Holmes's eyes had narrowed to two bright points. Both our nations, you say, not merely England, nor merely France. There are those, Mr. Holmes, who profit a great deal from selling the secrets of one power to another, and who owe loyalty to neither. I begin to fear we are dealing with such persons now. Chapter 6, Second Part. The Registry at Somerset House. While Mycroft's own inquiries proceeded through channels neither Holmes nor I were permitted to observe directly, Holmes himself spent the better part of a day at Somerset House, poring over the public registry of company deeds in search of whatever trace the Cinque Ports Subterranean Company might have left behind in more ordinary records than his brother's private files could supply. I accompanied him, though I confess I understood perhaps one word in 5 of the dense legal language through which he moved with such evident ease. Companies of this age were rarely dissolved cleanly, Watson, he remarked, drawing a heavy volume from the shelf and setting it upon the reading table before us. Their assets pass quietly from hand to hand. Their directors resign and are replaced without fanfare, and unless some particular scandal draws attention to them, they persist for decades, as little more than a name upon a page, forgotten by everyone, save the men who find it convenient to keep them alive. And you believe this company was kept alive deliberately? I believe it was kept alive with very great care indeed, Watson, precisely because a defunct company draws scrutiny the moment anyone attempts to use its old assets, whereas a company merely dormant, still technically in existence, still nominally paying its modest annual fees, excites no curiosity whatsoever. He turned the pages slowly, tracing a succession of small, dry entries with his finger. Observe here, in 1863, the company's registered office moved from Dover to a solicitor's chambers in Gray's Inn. In 1871, a new director was appointed, one Aldous Ferris, replacing a director who had, according to this entry, resigned owing to advancing age. And here, in 1884, a further filing renewing the company's lease upon certain unspecified freehold land in the county of Kent. 40 years of patient bookkeeping, I said, maintained solely to keep a tunnel legally invisible. 40 years of patient bookkeeping, Watson, maintained by a family, or perhaps a succession of families, who understood something that very few criminals ever trouble to learn, that the law is far more easily deceived by tedium than by daring. A single dramatic crime draws every eye in England. A dull company, renewing a dull lease, year upon unremarkable year, draws no eye at all. He closed the volume with a soft, final sound. Ashworth, or whoever first conceived this design, did not build merely a tunnel and a hidden siding. He built an entire small bureaucracy, dull enough to be forgotten, and forgotten precisely because it was dull. We spent a further hour tracing the solicitor's chambers in Gray's Inn, and Holmes, upon calling there under a plausible pretext, learned that the firm in question had handled the Cinque Ports Company's modest affairs for 3 successive generations of partners, none of whom, so far as the present clerk could determine, had ever met the elusive Mr. Ferris in person. All correspondence, he assured us, had, for as long as anyone could recall, been conducted entirely by letter, and settled, always, and without exception, in cash. A ghost upon paper, Holmes murmured, as we walked back toward Baker Street through the gathering evening, sustained for 4 decades by nothing more than punctual payments and unremarkable letters. It is, I confess, Watson, among the most patient pieces of criminal architecture I have yet encountered, and I find myself, despite everything this affair has already cost, unable to entirely withhold my admiration for the sheer discipline it must have required. You admire him, Holmes? I admire the structure, Watson, as one might admire the construction of a very cunning trap, without in the smallest degree admiring the hand that set it, nor forgetting for an instant the innocent creatures it was built to catch. He quickened his pace slightly as the first drops of a fresh evening rain began to fall. Come, I believe my brother's further inquiries, combined with what we have gathered today, will at last give us a name we can act upon, and a name, once we have it, that I do not intend to let escape us as easily as its owner has escaped honest scrutiny for the whole of his patient, dishonest life. Chapter 7. The Old Company's Ledger. It was Mycroft, once more, who provided the thread that carried us forward. For 2 days after our meeting with Fournier, a second folder arrived at Baker Street, bearing his seal, and within it, a single sheet torn, evidently with some difficulty, from a very old ledger. "My brother has been busy," Holmes remarked, studying the page with evident satisfaction. "This is a record of shareholders in the Cinque Ports Subterranean Company, dated 1851, the last year in which the company troubled to file any return whatsoever with the appropriate registry. What does it show? A small list of names, most long since dead, and one that persists, curiously, through every subsequent transfer of the company's leases down to the present day, always as trustee rather than owner, always careful to remain a single step removed from any document that might expose him to scrutiny." Holmes handed me the page. A Mr. Aldous Ferris. I stared at the name and felt, once again, that peculiar chill that seemed to attend every fresh discovery in this case. The false passenger. The false passenger, Watson, which tells us something of very great importance. Whoever devised this scheme did not invent the name Ferris idly, out of some passing fancy. He used, quite deliberately, the name under which he, or an associate, has controlled this old chalk company for the better part of 40 years. It was a signature, Watson, hidden in plain sight upon a manifest that no one but ourselves would ever trouble to examine closely. Then Ferris is our man. Ferris is a name, Watson, behind which a man has concealed himself for 4 decades. Finding the name is not the same as finding the man, though it brings us considerably closer. He rose, folding the ledger page carefully into his notebook. "I believe, Watson, that the time has come to walk the old spur line to its end, whatever lies at the end of it, and whatever risk that walk may carry." We assembled the following morning at the edge of Barham Wood. Holmes, myself, Lestrade with 2 constables, and, at Holmes's particular insistence, Fournier, who had proven himself, in the days since his first visit, both resourceful and genuinely useful, possessing a fluent knowledge of engineering matters that Holmes had come to value. The old railbed, once we had cleared enough undergrowth to follow it properly, ran for nearly 2 miles through increasingly dense woodland before the ground began, gradually, to rise, and the trees to thin, revealing at last the chalk downs Holmes had marked upon his map some days before. And there, set into the flank of the hill, and all but invisible beneath a screen of ivy and gorse that had grown up, unmistakably, by design rather than accident, we found the mouth of a tunnel. Lestrade drew his revolver without a word. Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. Let us first understand what we are entering before we announce our arrival with gunfire." He crouched at the tunnel's entrance and examined the ground carefully. Fresh cart tracks, recent footprints, several sets, made within the last day or 2. And here, he lifted, from a crevice in the rock, a small metal fragment, a fitting from a modern railway signal lamp of a pattern no more than 5 years old. "Then this is no relic," I said. "This tunnel is in use, in very active use indeed, Watson. I begin to suspect we are about to discover precisely where a train may vanish, and precisely what purpose might be served by making it do so." Chapter 7, Second Part. The Night Watchman of Smeeth. Before we ventured to walk the old spur to its end, Holmes insisted upon one further inquiry, and it was an inquiry that very nearly cost us the advantage of surprise we later found so valuable. "There is a man," he said, studying a small notebook in which he had recorded, over the preceding days, every scrap of testimony gathered along the line, employed by the railway company to watch the Smeeth Crossing gates through the night. His name is recorded nowhere in the official statements, and I find that omission considerably more interesting than anything that has actually been reported. We found him at last in a cottage near the crossing, an elderly man named Josiah Combe, who answered our knock with visible reluctance and admitted us only after Lestrade produced his warrant card. "I've nothing to say, sir. I told the company men already. I saw nothing that night." "You saw nothing," Holmes repeated pleasantly, seating himself uninvited beside the small fire. "And yet you have not slept easily since, I think, judging by the state of your eyes. And you have kept your gate lodge locked and bolted of an evening, in a manner your neighbours tell me is quite unlike your usual habit." Coombe's hands trembled faintly upon his knees. "A man came to me, sir, some days before the train was lost. Tall, well-spoken, not a local man. He gave me money, sir, more money than I earn in half a year, and told me only that I was to keep to my lodge that particular night, whatever I might hear or see upon the line, and forget entirely that he had ever called upon me." "And did you keep to your lodge?" "I did, sir, though I confess curiosity got the better of me near 11 o'clock, and I looked out through my window toward the cutting yonder." His voice dropped very low. "I saw lights, sir, moving through the trees where no lights ought to be, and I heard, very faint beneath the wind, what I could have sworn was the sound of an engine's wheels, though it seemed somehow to travel away from the line rather than along it, if you take my meaning." "I take it very precisely, Mr. Combe." Holmes's eyes had brightened with quiet triumph. "You have just confirmed, from an entirely independent witness, the very mechanism I had already begun to suspect. Tell me, can you describe this gentleman who paid you for your silence?" Combe considered a long while before answering. "Tall, sir, and grey-eyed, and dressed better than any man has cause to dress in these parts. He spoke softly, sir, the sort of voice that makes you feel foolish for ever having doubted him, though I could not for the life of me tell you why." "A most useful description, Mr. Combe, and I thank you for it. You have done nothing wrong in accepting his money, whatever guilt you may feel upon that account. A frightened man's silence bought with gold is a common enough weakness and rarely a criminal one. But I would ask that you now assist us, rather than him, by saying nothing at all of this visit to anyone until I give you leave." The old watchman agreed readily enough, plainly relieved to have unburdened himself at last. And as we walked back toward the village in the gathering dusk, Lestrade voiced the question already forming in my own mind. "A tall, grey-eyed gentleman of quiet and persuasive speech, Mr. Holmes. That description might fit half the well-bred criminals in England." "It might, Lestrade, and yet I begin to form a rather more particular impression of the man we seek than his description alone provides. Consider the pattern of his work. He does not threaten, he does not bully, he persuades and pays, and vanishes again before his victims quite understand what they have agreed to. A man who has practiced this particular art for a very long time, I should think, and practiced it, moreover, upon a very great number of people, judging by the ease and confidence with which he deploys it. You believe he has done this before. I believe, Watson, that a scheme requiring the patient corruption of railway clerks, porters, watchmen, and God knows how many others besides, all managed without a single one of them, until tonight, breaking silence, speaks of an organization with considerable resources and considerable experience, rather than a single clever man acting alone upon a sudden and desperate impulse. We are drawing closer to him, but I suspect, when we find him, we shall discover that the missing train from Dover is very far from the first mystery his patient and quiet genius has arranged. Chapter 8. Into the Chalk. The tunnel proved deeper and better maintained than any of us had anticipated. Gas piping ran along one wall, feeding a series of lamps spaced at careful intervals, and the rail bed beneath our feet, though old in its foundations, bore the unmistakable marks of recent relaying. New sleepers, fresh ballast, rails that gleamed, here and there, with the polish of regular use. Someone has spent a very great deal of money maintaining what the world believes to be an abandoned working, Holmes murmured as we advanced. This is not the enterprise of a single desperate man, Watson. This required capital and patience and years. We had proceeded perhaps a quarter-mile into the hill when the tunnel opened, quite suddenly, into a vast chamber hewn from the chalk itself, its roof supported by a forest of timber props, and there, standing silent upon a short length of track beneath the flickering gaslight, stood the Continental Express in its entirety. Engine, tender, 6 carriages, and guard's van, exactly as it had departed Dover 4 days before, save that every window along its length had been carefully curtained from within. Fournier gave a low exclamation in French. Even Lestrade, a man not easily startled after 20 years at the yard, stood for a long moment in silent astonishment. "Good God," he said at last. "It's all here. Every carriage." "Every carriage," Holmes agreed quietly. "And I think, Lestrade, if we proceed carefully, rather than announcing ourselves, we may find the passengers here also, for a train hidden this thoroughly, and maintained at such evident expense, was never intended merely as a grave." We advanced along the platform that had been constructed, with some care, beside the train, and it was Holmes who first noticed the sound. Low voices, and beneath them, unmistakably, the murmur of ordinary conversation, entirely unafraid, entirely at ease. "They are talking amongst themselves," I whispered, "not crying for help, not afraid." Holmes's brow furrowed at this. "Curious, most curious, Watson. One does not generally find the victims of an abduction quite so composed." He approached the nearest carriage and drew back the curtain from a single window, and what we saw within confirmed his observation entirely. Some dozen passengers seated comfortably, engaged in quiet conversation, several with books upon their laps, one elderly gentleman dozing peacefully in the corner, none of them displaying the smallest sign of distress. "They do not know," Fournier said softly. "They believe, perhaps, that some ordinary delay has occurred. Or they have been told something else entirely," Holmes said. "Something sufficiently plausible to keep 70 respectable Englishmen and women placid within a hidden chamber beneath the Kentish Downs for 4 days without a single one of them attempting to force a door." He turned from the window, and his expression had grown graver than I had yet seen it in this entire affair. This was never mere theft, Watson. A thief, who wished only Gerard's papers, would have taken them upon the train itself and let the rest continue to London unmolested. Someone required all 70 passengers removed together, kept calm, kept ignorant, and kept here for reasons that go a good deal beyond a single stolen document. "What reasons, Holmes?" Before he could answer, a voice spoke from the shadows behind us, calm, cultured, and entirely unhurried. "An excellent question, Mr. Holmes. I had rather hoped you would ask it." Chapter 9. Mr. Ferris. We turned as one. A tall man stood at the mouth of a side passage we had not previously noticed, dressed with quiet elegance, his grey eyes regarding us with something that might almost have been approval. 2 other men flanked him at a short distance, neither displaying any weapon, though something in their bearing suggested they required none to command the situation. "You have made remarkable progress," the newcomer continued. "Considerably more remarkable than I had allowed for, though I confess I rather hoped for it, in a private and perhaps unworthy corner of my ambition." "You are Mr. Ferris," Holmes said. "It was not a question. I have used that name, among several others, for longer than I care to admit. My own is Julian Ashworth, though it will mean nothing to you, nor, I suspect, will it trouble you greatly to learn it." He inclined his head slightly. "You have found my company's little inheritance, Mr. Holmes, 40 years of careful stewardship, and you have unearthed it in a matter of days. I confess to a certain professional admiration." Lestrade's hand moved toward his revolver, but Ashworth raised one hand, unhurried, almost gentle. "There is no need for that, Inspector. I have no quarrel with you, nor with any of your passengers, who will be released entirely unharmed the moment my purpose here is complete, which I assure you will be within the day. Violence was never a part of my design, save in one regrettable instance that I do not defend and shall not attempt to." "Gerard," Holmes said quietly. Ashworth's composure faltered, very slightly, for the first time. "Monsieur Gerard was not meant to die, Mr. Holmes. He was meant only to be relieved, briefly and without incident, of a document he carried, and returned to his fellow travelers none the wiser. He resisted with a courage I had not anticipated, and my associate, in his alarm, did something that cannot be undone. I have regretted it every hour since." "He is dead, then?" My voice, when I spoke, sounded strange even to my own ears. "He is, Doctor, and his body lies in a chamber beyond this one, and I intend, before this affair concludes, to see that it is returned to his government, with whatever dignity such a wretched circumstance permits. I am a thief, gentlemen, not a murderer, whatever this unhappy accident may suggest, and I take no pleasure in the distinction being blurred." Holmes studied him a long moment. "You have built an extraordinary machine, Mr. Ashworth, spanning 40 years and an entire hidden railway, for the sake, I begin to suspect, of considerably more than a single stolen survey." "You suspect correctly." Ashworth gestured toward the passage behind him. "Will you walk with me a little further, Mr. Holmes? I find myself, oddly, rather eager for you to understand precisely what it is you have uncovered, before this matter is concluded one way or another." Chapter 10. The True Purpose. We followed him, not without misgiving, along the side passage, which opened, after some 100 yards, into a second chamber, considerably smaller than the first, lined with cabinets and shelves, upon which rested, I saw with growing astonishment, an enormous archive of documents, maps, and ledgers, evidently gathered over a very long span of years. "My grandfather," Ashworth said, moving among the shelves with the ease of long familiarity, "acquired control of this old company in 1849, at a time when England and France eyed one another with considerable suspicion, and when a private concern, capable of moving persons and materials unseen beneath the coast of Kent, possessed, shall we say, a certain quiet value to interested parties on both sides of the Channel." "You are a smuggler of information," Holmes said, "not merely of goods. Information, Mr. Holmes, documents, occasionally persons who found it convenient to disappear from one life and reappear elsewhere in another. My grandfather built this trade with great care and greater discretion. My father expanded it. I flatter myself, refined it into something approaching an art." He drew a ledger from the shelf and set it upon a table between us. "The 70 passengers you found in that carriage, Mr. Holmes, were never my true concern. They were, if you will forgive the coldness of the expression, my cover. Gerard's papers were valuable, certainly, and I do not pretend the money offered for them was unwelcome, but the true purpose of stopping that train, upon that night, in that place, was considerably older and considerably more delicate." He opened the ledger to a page marked with a slip of ribbon, and I saw, inscribed there in a careful hand, a list of names entirely unfamiliar to me. "There is a gentleman," Ashworth continued, "who has for some years served a certain foreign government in a capacity his own nation would regard as treasonous in the extreme, were his identity ever to become known. He required, urgently, a means of leaving England unseen, without record, without trace, at a moment of his own choosing rather than his master's. I arranged that he should board the Continental Express at Dover under an assumed identity, indistinguishable among 70 ordinary travellers, and that the entire train should vanish long enough for him to leave it, quietly, through this tunnel and continue his journey by other means entirely, while every eye in England searched instead for a missing express and its innocent passengers. Holmes's expression had grown very still. The false name of Ferris upon the manifest was not merely your signature then. It was a second deception entirely, layered atop the first, so that even should someone discover the falsified count, they would assume the invented passenger to be your invention alone and search no further. Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. You uncovered the outer layer of my design with admirable speed. I confess, I had rather hoped the inner layer might yet escape you a little longer. And has your true passenger already departed? For the first time, something like genuine hesitation crossed Ashworth's features. 2 days passed, Mr. Holmes, by a fishing vessel arranged along the coast some miles from here. He is, I should imagine, already beyond any hand that either of our governments might raise against him. A cold silence settled over the chamber. I saw Holmes's jaw tighten, very slightly, the only outward sign of an anger he otherwise mastered with considerable discipline. Then the true purpose of this entire elaborate machine has already been achieved, Holmes said quietly, and everything that remains, the hidden train, the frightened families, Gerard's murder, the 70 passengers held here for 4 days, all of it is merely the wreckage left behind once the true business was concluded. I am afraid, Mr. Holmes, that is precisely the case. Ashworth closed the ledger with a soft, final sound. I do not ask your forgiveness. I ask only, perhaps, your understanding that the world contains men who serve interests you, and I shall never fully comprehend, and that I have merely provided, for a considerable fee, the means by which such men occasionally vanish. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. You speak of your work as though it were an art, Holmes said at last, his voice low and hard. And yet, Professor, forgive me, Monsieur Gerard, lies dead in the chamber beyond us, and 70 families in London have spent 4 sleepless nights, believing their husbands, their wives, their children, lost to some incomprehensible catastrophe. I find your art considerably less admirable than you appear to find it yourself. Ashworth's composure did not waver, though something behind his eyes seemed, for the briefest moment, to falter. I have told you already, Mr. Holmes, that Gerard's death was neither planned nor desired. As for the passengers' distress, I did what I could to minimize it. They have been fed, sheltered, and told a story of a landslip upon the line, requiring a lengthy and delicate rescue, a story sufficiently plausible that not one of them has thought to doubt it. I am not without conscience, whatever else you may believe of me. A conscience employed selectively is scarcely a conscience at all. Holmes turned toward Lestrade. Inspector, I believe you have heard enough to proceed. Lestrade stepped forward, his revolver now drawn without pretense. Julian Ashworth, alias Aldous Ferris, I am arresting you in connection with the abduction of 70 persons and the murder of one Monsieur Gerard, a subject of the French Republic. I ask only one thing in return for the entirely voluntary surrender you are about to receive, that the passengers be released with the greatest possible gentleness, and that whatever explanation is eventually given to the newspapers spare, so far as it reasonably can, the reputations of the innocent people who travelled that night through no fault of their own. That, said Holmes, is a request I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, willing to support. The arrest itself proceeded with a strange and almost courteous quiet, entirely unlike the violent conclusions I had witnessed in other cases at Holmes's side. Ashworth's 2 associates surrendered without protest, and within the hour, constables summoned from Ashford had begun the delicate business of leading 70 bewildered but entirely unharmed passengers back through the tunnel and out into the grey Kentish daylight, where a train, hastily arranged, waited to carry them home. Fournier remained a long while beside the chamber where Gerard's body had been found, and when at last he rejoined us, his eyes were red, though his voice, when he spoke, remained steady. He will be returned to France with honour, Mr. Holmes. I thank you for that, whatever else this dreadful affair has cost. The honor is owed to him, not to my efforts, Holmes replied quietly. I am sorry. We did not arrive in time to save him. Chapter 12. The question that remained. It was Watson, myself, who raised upon our journey back to London that evening the question that had troubled me since Ashworth's confession in the archive chamber. Holmes, the true passenger, this traitor whose escape Ashworth arranged, has fled entirely beyond our reach. Does that not mean the very heart of this affair remains unsolved? Holmes, seated across from me in the swaying carriage, was silent for a long moment before he answered. It means, Watson, that one thread of this affair has escaped us, which is a very different thing from the whole affair remaining unsolved. I have already given Mycroft the ledger names Ashworth, so obligingly left within our reach, together with a description of the fishing vessel and the stretch of coast from which it departed. My brother's department will pursue that thread with considerably greater resources and considerably greater patience than you or I could bring to it ourselves. Some mysteries, Watson, are solved in an afternoon. Others require years, and quiet men in quiet offices, working long after the newspapers have forgotten there was ever a mystery at all. And Ashworth himself. Ashworth will stand trial, and I have little doubt he will hang for Gerard's murder, whatever comfort he takes in disclaiming the intention behind it. As for the empire he built beneath these downs, Mycroft assures me it will be dismantled entirely, the tunnels sealed once more, this time under proper government supervision rather than a private company's 40 years of patient concealment. I considered this for a while in silence, watching the darkening fields of Kent slide past the window. It is a strange resolution, Holmes. The train is found, the passengers are safe, and yet the true purpose behind it all, the reason the whole elaborate machine was built in the first place, escapes into the fog and is never punished at all. Most conspiracies end that way, Watson, if we are honest about them. We solve the visible portion and console ourselves that the invisible portion has, at least, been made a little more difficult to repeat. He turned his gaze toward the window, and I saw, in the reflection of the carriage lamp against the glass, an expression of genuine, unhidden weariness. I confess, this case has left me less satisfied than most. We saved 70 innocent lives, and that is no small thing. But somewhere beyond the reach of English law, a man carries secrets that may yet cost a great many more lives than were ever at risk aboard that train, and I could not stop him. Neither of us spoke again for a long while, and the train carried us onward through the darkness toward London, past the very cutting at Barham Wood, where the whole strange affair had begun, now marked, I noticed as we passed, by a single lantern left burning at the mouth of the old spur line, a small and lonely point of light against the vast, indifferent dark of the Kentish night. Chapter 13. Baker Street, once more. 3 days later, Holmes and I sat once again in the familiar comfort of our rooms at Baker Street, the fire burning low, the case, so far as the newspapers were concerned, already concluding itself into a manageable and considerably simplified account of a landslip, a delay, and a fortunate rescue. Lestrade had called that morning to report that Ashworth's associates had begun, under careful questioning, to yield further names, further threads, further fragments of the great buried enterprise the old chalk company had represented, and that Mycroft's department expressed itself, in its own understated fashion, well satisfied with the progress made. "You are troubled still, Holmes," I observed, watching him turn his violin absently in his hands without playing it. "I am considering, Watson, what it was that made this case so peculiarly difficult to see clearly, even once every physical fact had been assembled before us." He set the violin aside. We assumed, from the very first telegram, that the mystery lay in the disappearance itself, in the impossible vanishing of an entire train, and so it did, in a sense. But the true mystery, the one that mattered, lay hidden a layer deeper still, in the question of why anyone should trouble to make 70 innocent people vanish at all. when a single man's quiet escape might have been arranged far more simply, by far less spectacular means? Why did he not simply arrange it more simply then? Because a single man slipping quietly away invites careful scrutiny of that single man, Watson. But 70 people vanishing together, along with the very train that carried them, invites scrutiny of an entirely different and far more sensational kind, one that consumes every newspaper, every official mind, every resource Scotland Yard can muster, upon the wrong question entirely. Ashworth did not hide his true passenger behind darkness or distance, Watson. He hid him behind our own astonishment. He gave us a mystery so vast and so strange that we very nearly forgot to ask the smaller, quieter question underneath it. Not where did the train go, but who, precisely, needed it to disappear, and why? I turned this over for a long moment, and found in it, I confess, something of the deeper lesson Holmes so often extracted from his cases. The lesson that lingered longest after the particular facts of any single mystery had faded from memory. Then the true trick, Holmes, was never the train at all. No, Watson. The true trick was persuading 70 respectable Englishmen and women, and in time the whole of London besides, to marvel at the impossible, so thoroughly that none of us thought to look past it, toward the perfectly possible, perfectly ordinary act of one guilty man walking quietly away while the entire world stared, astonished, at an empty stretch of track. He reached at last for his violin in earnest, drew the bow gently across the strings, and let a soft, unhurried melody fill the room. Give a man something extraordinary to wonder at, Watson, and he will very rarely think to ask what small, ordinary thing that wonder was built to conceal. Outside, the fog had begun to settle once more over Baker Street, soft and grey and endless, and within our rooms the fire burned on, and Sherlock Holmes, having closed the singular affair of the missing train from Dover, allowed himself, for one quiet evening at least, the rare luxury of rest before whatever new mystery London's endless, restless dark might next choose to send his way. Chapter 14. A letter from Mycroft. It was some 6 weeks later, upon a bright and unseasonably mild morning in early winter, that a letter arrived at Baker Street, bearing Mycroft's seal, and Holmes read it through twice before setting it upon the breakfast table with an expression I found difficult to interpret. "News of Ashworth's trial?" I asked. "The trial concluded as we expected. He will hang within the month, and has, I am told, made no further attempt to deny his part in Gerard's death, whatever comfort he continues to take in disclaiming its intention." Holmes tapped the letter thoughtfully. "But there is a further matter here that concerns me rather more, concerning the true passenger, the man whose escape all of this was arranged to conceal. Concerning precisely that man, Watson, Mycroft's department has traced the fishing vessel to a small port upon the Belgian coast, and from there, with considerably greater difficulty, a single set of railway tickets purchased under yet another false name, leading eastward toward Vienna." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking out upon the ordinary, unremarkable traffic of Baker Street below. "The thread grows thin, Watson, as such threads generally do, and I do not know that it will ever be drawn to its full length. But it has not been abandoned, and that, I think, is the most any of us can honestly claim of the quieter, more patient half of this profession." "You still consider the case unfinished, then?" "I consider it, Watson, precisely what most of the truly great crimes eventually become, half solved, half suspected, and wholly unresolved in the one particular that matters most, which is whether the harm already done can ever be entirely undone. We saved 70 lives. We brought one murderer to justice, and dismantled an enterprise that had operated undisturbed beneath an English hillside for the better part of 40 years. That is no small accomplishment, and I do not undervalue it." He turned from the window, and something in his expression softened, very slightly, into an emotion nearer to resignation than defeat. "But I have learned, over the long course of this curious profession, that the largest and most dangerous game is rarely caught in a single afternoon's clever hunting. Sometimes the very best a detective can do is wound it badly enough and mark its trail clearly enough that some other hunter, better placed and better patient than himself, may finish the pursuit in his own good time. I considered this a long while in silence, watching the fire settle in the grate, and found myself, not for the first time in our long association, grateful that I had been permitted to witness even the imperfect resolutions of Sherlock Holmes's extraordinary mind, rather than only the triumphant ones the public so much preferred to read about in the pages of the Strand. "Will you write of it, Watson?" Holmes asked at length, with the faint, familiar trace of amusement that so often lightened his more somber moods. "The missing train, I mean. I make no doubt the public would find it a most sensational tale." "I believe I shall, Holmes, though I confess I do not yet know how to end it satisfactorily, given that the truest villain of the piece remains, by your own account, entirely beyond our reach. Then end it honestly, my dear Watson, which is very often the only ending a true case ever permits." He reached at last for his pipe and settled once more into his chair beside the fire, and for a long while neither of us spoke again, content, for that one quiet morning at least, to let the case rest exactly where the truth itself had left it, neither fully closed nor fully open, but honestly and carefully told. The end.